Nos faltan unos segundos para las 9 y comenzaremos a las 9 en punto. Muy bien, muy buenos días, tengan todos ustedes y muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Mi nombre es Rosana Echeandía y desde la dirección de la carrera de Comunicación y Periodismo de la Universidad Peruana de Ciencias Aplicadas, les doy una calurosa bienvenida a este encuentro. Es un verdadero honor tener como invitado esta mañana a Jeff Jarvis, reconocido periodista y profesor de la Escuela de Periodismo de la City University de Nueva York. Jeff además ha escrito numerosos libros, entre ellos varios bestsellers, ¿no? Como ¿y Google cómo lo haría? Esa es una de sus especialidades, el tema de las redes sociales, que a veces a los periodistas tanto nos atormentan. Y otro libro que he escrito es El fin de los medios de comunicación de masas, que es un título que nos apela con fuerza a nosotros los periodistas también. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us this morning. Vamos a escuchar al profesor Jarvis acerca de cómo ve la grave situación por la que atraviesan los medios de comunicación. Precisamente en los últimos días, todos nosotros hemos sido testigos del impacto tremendo que ha tenido el COVID-19 en un periodismo que ya venía seriamente herido en el Perú. Y muchos colegas nuestros, alrededor de 300 o quizás más si sumamos de otros medios, han perdido sus puestos de trabajo. Hacia el final vamos a tener algunos minutos para que el público que está participando pueda presentar sus preguntas y para ello nos va a apoyar la periodista y profesora Natalia Tarnabiecki. Gracias, Natalia, para poder transmitirle a Jeff todas nuestras preguntas. So thank you very much, dear Jeff. We are really honored and really happy to have you here with you this morning, and we are all ears for you. Go on.
Muchísimas gracias. Lo siento por mi español. When we started a bilingual program at the Newmark Journalism School, I started doing Spanish lessons every day in the car. And then came the crazy American election, and I had to listen to the news, and I'm too old to learn. So I appreciate that you're all listening to me in Inglés. And I just feel like the dumb American who speaks only one language, but I'm grateful to you. I'm going to depress you, but since many of you are students, let me start off by saying this. Believe it or not, this is the right time to study journalism and become a journalist, because you are going to reinvent journalism. You are going to reconsider what journalism is. You should learn everything you're taught by your wonderful professors, but then question everything. Ask how we got here, why we got here, follow the money, understand the economics, understand why we did things traditionally this way, and then ask, is there a better way? And I am confident that you will find better ways. I wish I had a solution for where we are in journalism today. I don't. We have tracked many messiahs trying to think that they will save us, but all our messiahs are false messiahs. There is no simple answer that is going to return us to the journalism and the business that was. The world has changed fundamentally. The good news in one sense is I think we have a very long timetable. We are only 25 years away from the introduction of the commercial web browser. In Gutenberg terms, it's the year 1475. That looks good. It's a very long time. The bad news is the pain in the industry has just begun. It will get worse, I think. Our fundamental model, which was to make a product we called content to draw an audience and sell that audience to advertisers, is broken, probably forever. I'm not saying that advertising will go away, but the business model we had with advertising does not work in a world of abundance on the internet, where there can be no end of ads. We don't own a scarcity anymore. Charging subscriptions, Well, I don't think that's going to save us either, because I think that returns us to what occurred before the first newspapers. I'm going to go back to Gutenberg. 1450 was when Gutenberg released his Bible. It took a century and a half until 1605 until the first newspaper was invented. And so when I say we're at the year 1475, we're very early in. Before the newspaper, there were paid, expensive, private newsletters called avisi that were sent to business people. They were very expensive. They were for the privileged. Well, I'm afraid that's what we're returning to now with paywalls, where the privileged can afford to have journalism and the rest cannot. And I worry about that world. So paywalls will not save us. Our house was already on fire. The media house was on fire. COVID came and threw gunpowder on the fire. It has exploded. Things are going to burn down. I do worry about that. I know that you have major problems in the business there as we have here. This is very difficult for journalists and for the communities they serve. But I do have hope that you, students, graduates, will build new sprouts from the ashes, that you will invent new forms and new kinds and new models of journalism. So what do? Where do we start? We have a program at the Newmark School in News, Innovation, and Leadership with very high-end managers in the industry. And one of them said, when I asked this question of them, that you probably can only start doing one thing. And she suggested you start doing either transparency journalism or service journalism. And I would add a third, community journalism. We want to end up with all three: transparency, service, and community. But if you're going to start something new, start one. So on transparency, that means accountability. That means investigative journalism. That means, of course, trying to hold power to account, whether that power is in government or in business. That is the crucial and highest value of journalism. That is what we must figure out how to preserve. That is vital. But it's not all that journalism has. I think we can do investigative journalism in new ways by collaborating with each other in journalism and with the public. And there are a number of models out there about how this works. One I like is called City Bureau in Chicago, where they train citizens to go cover meetings and pay them to do it. So we have more transparency about government. Ground Source is another one. There's many like this that try to collaborate with the public and work on projects. Another one is called Reveal, and they end up creating very creative responses to journalism, where they sometimes serve a community by doing a play or a comic book or things like that. So investigative journalism, accountability journalism, transparency journalism is vital. But there's also service. And by this, I mean that I think journalism itself is a service to communities and to individuals. We have to recognize that we are here to help people improve their lives and their communities. And that can take many, many forms. And so we have to get to the idea of, for example, how do you serve parents? Well, there's not a lot of news in diapers, but you might give them databases of information about growing children. You might help them connect with other parents to do things. You might give them bargains for the things they have to buy. There are plenty of things you can do that fit into that idea of service, of helping people's lives. And then there is community. That to me is the most important thing in journalism. I believe that is the core and essence of what journalism must be, is serving communities. We started a degree at Newmark that we call social journalism. And it's not just social media, it's about understanding communities. Our students in that program don't start with content. They start with community. They pick a community that is self-defined, not bullshit like millennials. There's no such thing as millennials, but a community that means something to each other. Some examples: African Americans who suffer from depression, recovering addicts, street musicians. These are communities that exist because they have a definition of themselves they share, they have needs they share. That's a community. So The students begin by observing the community, listening to the community, reflecting the community's needs, empathizing with those needs, understanding those needs, and then deciding what journalism we can bring. Last year's class in social journalism had a wide variety of projects that were not just writing stories. One student is a recovering addict, and she created a database of useful information and services for recovering addicts. Another student lost a member of her family to addiction. She created a mechanism to bring families together so they could share empathy over their loss. Another student from Brazil was serving women who had been abused. She used the theater of the oppressed to get them to act out and change the endings of their stories. These are very creative ways to consider what journalism is. The problem is that ever since Gutenberg, we have thought that journalism is a factory to create a product that we call content to fill things we call publications. That's a very limited view of what journalism is. If we instead think that journalism is a service, then it opens up all kinds of new possibilities. I follow closely the words of the late professor James Carey from Columbia, who tells us that society, democracy, is a conversation. And that conversation is meant to be cacophonous, that is to say, noisy and loud. Indeed, I think what's happening now in society is that we are relearning how to have a conversation with ourselves. Ever since Gutenberg, ever since the press, that public conversation has been very controlled by editors. Too often, editors who look like me, old white men. And now comes the internet that opens up the conversation so that more people can finally be heard. These aren't new voices. These are voices that have always been there, but they were ignored by mass media. Indeed, the problem is that mass media tries to treat everybody as if they are all the same. We had to do that because we only had one product to sell everyone. But that was a lie. It was always an insult and a lie to the public. And so we moved past the idea of the mass to understand people as individuals and members of communities. And that is how we have to serve them. So as a result, I created a new definition from journalism. I have tenure at my university. I can do obnoxious things like that. And so my definition of journalism now that I work under, my goal for journalism is to convene communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. Informed is in the middle. That's very important. That's core to what we do. But we also need to be respectful. We need to understand each other and figure out how to do that. And productive means that the journalism has to exist for a reason to help communities meet their own goals. So to convene communities into respectful, informed, and productive conversation. That's what I think journalism is and should be. There's a small company in California that I quite like called Spaceship Media, and they do just that. They bring together communities to have discussion. In the first project they did after the American election, presidential election, and by the way, I apologize for what we are doing to the world. She brought together, Eve Perlman brought together 25 women who had voted for Trump in Alabama and the American South, 25 who had voted for Hillary Clinton in liberal San Francisco. The journalists talked to them all, and then they threw them all into a private Facebook group. First day was fine, second day was hell. But then something wonderful occurred. The members of the community came to the journalist and said, "We're getting in trouble over here. Can you look up some stuff for us?" That is to say that they valued an informed conversation. They wanted facts, and they trusted the journalist to get them. And the journalist then delivered what Spaceship calls fact stacks, just the facts. They didn't even write stories. They said, here's what you asked to know. Here's what you're confused about. Here's what you're wrong about. Here's what you're arguing about. Here are facts to inform your conversation. James Carey, again, said that journalism, though, doesn't really inform the public conversation. It is informed by the public conversation. And all of this is to say that the most important skill that we have to learn as journalists, and people my age are not good at this. The most important skill you need to demonstrate as journalists is to listen. We're not good at that. We tend to go out with a story idea in mind, with blanks to fill in, and we get quotes to fill in our story. That's not really listening. Listening to people is understanding and empathizing with their needs. And look what social media, for all its problems, has enabled around the world and in the United States, especially now. We had issues around disinformation, we thought, after the American election, and then came COVID. And COVID in the United States revealed the terrible inequities that have always been in this country around racism, and how African-American, Latino American communities are more susceptible to the disease and to death for many presumed reasons. They are our essential workers we suddenly now value. They live in more crowded conditions. They have to take subways to work. These are the presumptions about what's happening there. And so the inequity was there. And then came the murder by police of George Floyd, which only, of course, amplified the problem in a way that now no one in my country can or should ignore it. And what this reveals, I think, is the problem of mass media. When I was raised in America, I was raised on the presumption of what we called the melting pot, that we would all be the same someday. Well, that was actually a racist view of saying we would all act white, rather than valuing everyone's communities. So along comes Twitter and Facebook, enabling the hashtag as a platform so that Black Lives Matter could begin. And another hashtag, Living While Black, which shows those of us who don't know the peril that Black Americans live in when white Americans call the police on them, perhaps to a death sentence. And so what we see here is that media failed. Media, again, run by old white men, didn't think these were stories. I hear this to this day of people from underrepresented communities saying that editors and professors tell them, oh, your story isn't big enough. It doesn't affect everyone. Not everyone would read that. That was the problem of mass media. It had to be everyone. Well, everyone was the majority, and that was a tyranny. So now we have the ability to share information. The courageous 17-year-old young woman who recorded on video the murder of George Floyd put that on Facebook so people could see it. Communities gather using the hashtag as a platform to find each other, to come together, to organize, and to act. Now, what I'm talking about sounds a lot like activism. I'm not afraid of that idea when it comes to journalism. I think that journalism has to uphold standards, many standards, of accuracy, of fairness, of intellectual honesty, of telling uncomfortable truths. But we also have to stand for a North Star, which is that we stand for helping people improve their lives and their communities. And I argue that Facebook and Twitter should hold the same standard with the same goal, to convene communities into conversation and to hold a North Star of improving the world. They're not doing a very good job of that. Neither are we in journalism. You can change that. So how the hell do you do this and eat? That is the other problem. I think that some people say in our industry, oh, journalism's fine, we have a business model problem. No, I've just gone through how I think that journalism has a journalism problem, but we also have a business problem. And I think that the sprouts that will rise from the ashes of what burns down in old journalism will have to start very small. We're starting another new program at Newmark in January. It's a new version of our entrepreneurial journalism program, where we believe that a lot of journalism is going to come from individual, resilient journalists who learn how to be sustainable, serving communities on their own, using tools like newsletters, podcasts, YouTube videos, Instagram, TikTok, Medium, you name it. And they'll have to raise money in all kinds of different ways. Maybe they get paid by YouTube or Medium. Maybe they raise money from Patreon, from people out there who care about them. Maybe they sell books. Maybe they have events. It's not going to be an easy life, but it is a way that you can hold on to some independence. You can serve a community, and you can try to put together a living doing that. If your work is good and necessary, I believe enough people will support it to make it work. But I can't guarantee that. We don't know yet whether that is true. That is unproven. I think we see some beginnings. In the United States, we've always had a model of public media here where we're not supported by government, but instead by people who contribute money, 10% of the audience, so that everyone can have it for free. The Guardian now has more than 1 million people who've contributed to The Guardian. In Madrid, El Diario has advertising, but it also has memberships, but it's also then free to the public. We have platforms like Patreon and Kickstarter that can enable you to get some support from the public. Again, I cannot guarantee you this will work, but I think it's what we need to try. I have one student of mine who was very dubious about all of this, and we would joke each other that I was the capitalist and she was not. Well, she's just started something new, serving a part of New York State, and she's very excited because she's gotten some money doing it and people value her work. And so I'm going to tell her that I think she's now a capitalist like me. We still need advertising. I think advertising will provide a support for journalism. It is still necessary. Obviously, in the pandemic, advertising has fallen away. Some will come back, but we have to reinvent advertising. We have to rethink it away from the mass media billboard structure we had into a way that provides more relevance to people and more value. You know, we watched some odd things that go on. I saw a newspaper in Germany that in the pandemic is helping local stores by delivering beer and shoes and office supplies to the readers. I kind of like the idea of a newspaper delivering beer. And my colleague, Anita Zelina, who's from Austria, said, oh yes, the paper she used to work for, Der Standard, bought a bread company to deliver rolls, pastry, every morning with the newspaper. I'm not suggesting you go start a bakery, but I am suggesting that there are creative business models out there that we will explore and that we try to work at a small level. Oftentimes I hear people say, Jeff, your ideas are cute, but they don't give us scale. They don't give us all the journalism we had. They don't rebuild our newsrooms to the way they were 10 years ago. That's not going to happen. We were an inefficient industry. In the United States, we had monopolies in cities. We're never going to return to that. We're going to have to think small and start small again. And I think that there may be some money from foundations and philanthropists, but never enough to cover all of the journalism we need. And you may get stretched having to do many things to make it work in your journalism. You may get money from Patreon. You may get money from YouTube. You may have to have events. You may have to figure out how to do advertising. This is not easy. But one way or another, I believe that society will demand our journalism, will need our journalism, and we'll figure out how to do that. So I hope I didn't depress you. Don't leave journalism school. Stay in, but be bold, be brave, listen to what you're taught, listen well, but then again, question it. Ask, why do we do it this way? Is it because we were trying to serve everybody in the mass audience? How can we do it a better way? How can we serve people and communities? And understand your first job is to listen to those communities and understand their needs so that you can help them build better communities themselves. That's what I wanted to say to you this morning. And I wanted to have some time so we can have discussion before I have to run off to my next event in the next hour. So.
Good morning, Jeff. This is Natalia Tarnavieski. I'm a teacher. I'll just briefly turn my camera on so you can see me. Sorry, my child was toying around with the background. I'm now in space. That is the digital age. I'm really sorry. Anyway, I'll turn my video camera off. I thank you so much for your time. And it's so relevant what you're saying. We are so grateful for your ideas. Before I turn to the chat, I will just say in Spanish, welcome the community to ask questions. Por favor, si ya podrían colocar en el chat sus preguntas para poder iniciar la conversación con con Jeff Jarvis. Well, I'll launch a question of my own just to get it started. Social journalism, maybe you want to elaborate a little bit about that. I think I saw an interview that you held with The Atlantic about responsibility, that as journalists, we've given responsibility for the content to business owners rather than taking it in our own hands. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about social journalism. Le preguntaba a Jeff sobre el componente social de esta propuesta que él tiene de regresar el periodismo a la comunidad. Yes?
So social journalism started with the idea that we need to serve communities, a relationship-based model. In mass media, we treat everyone all the same, and we don't understand people as individuals. We don't understand what matters to them, their affinities. So I argued that we had to start this. And my dean read a third of a book I wrote about that and said, do we teach this in depth at the school? And I said, no, not really. She said, how about a new degree then? So hallelujah, we have a new degree. In that degree, students, as I said, find a community that is self-defined. That could be a neighborhood, but it could also be one student this year is working on sex workers, for example, online. Observe that community, listen to that community, understand that community's needs, reflect back to that community and say, is this what I heard you say? Is this what your needs are? Do I understand you well? And then come back and imagine the kind of journalism that we could provide to that community. And as I said before, that may not just be articles and stories and text and photos, not things about them, but things for them. I've learned a lot teaching this program because the students have taken that simple idea and they've brought it to life and they've made it real and they've challenged it. One thing I learned in teaching social journalism is to differentiate internally focused from externally focused journalism. Externally focused journalism is what we've always done. I'm going to tell your story to the world. And if I do that, good things will happen because the world will hear of your problems. That's still necessary. That will always be necessary. But internally focused journalism is about the information needs of a community. Some of our students in another program at the school did a program on mold, black mold in public housing that makes it very difficult to breathe and to live. And they chose to go into the community and observe what was the problem, listen to people's problems, and then teach them how to find the mold, how to fix the mold, how to complain to the city for the mold, how to get treated for the health problems that come from the mold. So they were dealing with the internal information needs of that community. They were doing work for the community rather than about the community. Too often in journalism, we exploit the stories of people for our own benefit. We get people to come and read about tragedy and about crime and about suffering without doing anything to help the situation. So social journalism argues that we have the ability and power to try to help communities if we work with them. There are some related movements. There's one called solutions journalism, which just says that we shouldn't end the story with how wrong everything is. We should give people the opportunity to find their own solutions and help them do that. Then there's another one called constructive journalism out of Europe that argues that the picture we present in journalism of the world is too negative and is wrong. All we present is strife and crime and trouble and hatred and fear. That, in fact, that's not what people's everyday lives are like. And we need to do a better job of providing a truer picture of people's lives so that we can then improve it from there, rather than thinking the world has gone to hell and there's nothing we can do about it, which is too often what journalism presents.
Thank you, Jeff. A lot of people have written in the chat. I don't know if you want to read it on your own or do you want me to read it out?
Why don't you pick out some of the best stuff, some of which will be in Espanol, which is fine.
Okay. I'll read it out in English because I've written in English. So Rocio Yeren says, in Peru, the future is gray. Some newspapers with years in the market have closed and several colleagues have lost their jobs. Are we the only ones in that complicated situation?
No. I think it's true world around. The markets, our markets and our countries and cultures are very different. And I don't mean to say that they're the same. You have more national brands in Peru than we've had in the US because we're just so big. Europe also has national brands that have more voices, which I think is healthy. But news organizations are suffering the world around. In the United States, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal are doing well. They have paywalls. People pay for them. And in fact, some fairly large portion of the American population does pay for news, but 70% of what they pay goes to those three publications. So that's to say that everybody else gets very little, but everybody else thinks they're going to make it with paywalls because their advertising has disappeared, and they're not. So now in the United States, every major newspaper chain is owned either by a hedge fund of investors or by families that are exhausted now. And that means they're not going to invest in innovation in those news organizations. And those news organizations, many of them will shrink to the point that they'll die, or they might as well because they've become so bad. So the question is, do we hold on to those old organizations or build new ones? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't want to give up on important institutions that have mattered in our countries and democracies, but at the same count, I don't know whether they are capable of making the radical change they need to make to adjust. We are 25 years away from the beginning of the commercial web, yet we still pretty much run newspapers the way we always have. And that does not indicate that we're very good at innovation. So again, as journalists and students, it's not going to be easy, but I urge you to look at individually or in groups, find a community that is not served well. That could be local community, that could be a community of people who share an interest, like trans people in Peru. That could be a business community. The next hour, I'm going to talk to somebody who runs something for the travel industry. Find something that is not served well, understand what they need, figure out how to serve them, and I think you could probably make a living out of that. But again, I don't guarantee it.
Guillermo Falcón asks the following question. Do you think the pandemic there will be a before and after in journalism, before the pandemic and after the pandemic?
A great question. Yes, I think in a few ways. One is obviously the business has been hurt badly and that won't all come back. But two is, I think that we have finally, in American media, seen the impact of inequality that doesn't just go to jobs or income or police violence. It even goes to the impact on health in the pandemic. So that racism becomes the primary story across so much in my country. And then third, I find this very interesting to watch how scientists have been using the internet in this crisis. They have a new open information ecosystem. It used to be you wrote a scientific paper, it got reviewed by your peers, it got published in a scientific journal, which was very expensive. Very few people saw it. End of story. Well, now there have been more than 10,000 papers about COVID written by scientists since the pandemic began. And they're putting them up online instantly in what they call preprint servers. That's to say they're not peer reviewed yet, but they're sharing the data and they're sharing the information. And that is critical. So the scientists realized they had to make information open and free to be able to share it and get value out of it. But there's so much, how do they find it? Well, there are some efforts to organize that information, very important. But some of that information is crap. Some of those scientists didn't do good work. They need to be challenged. So what the scientists have done is they've recreated the system of peer review on Twitter. And on Twitter, I'll see a paper go up, and within hours, I will see important scientists come in and review that paper piece by piece and say what works and doesn't work. That's the work of science. I also see them reviewing each other and deciding who has qualifications. And finally, I see them try to explain all this to the public. When the pandemic struck, I decided that I wanted to look at amplifying expertise as our primary job. After the American election, we thought disinformation was our primary challenge, and our job was to kill disinformation, probably impossible to ever do. But in this pandemic, our enemy isn't Russian bots. Our enemy is ignorance. And so the cure to ignorance is expertise. That's what we understand in journalism. We know how to do that. So I started a Twitter list. I'll type it into the message right now. Sorry, I can't do two things at once. bit.ly/COVID Twitter list. There I have 600 scientists, epidemiologists, virologists, biologists, geneticists, public health experts who are on top of the COVID crisis. And it is phenomenal to watch them be able to do all this science in public. So I think we in journalism have a lot to learn from the scientists, how they adapted to an open information ecosystem, making information open and organized and reviewed and clear to the public. We need to do the same thing. I interviewed 4 of these scientists on video, and you can find that at buzzmachine.com, which is my blog. And they talked about the right ways to cover this pandemic, which means that we've got to do a very good job, better than we have in the past, of finding the most relevant experts to answer our questions. So that there are new skills I think we will learn as journalists across any field from the science of COVID.
I will resume in one question. I think a lot of people still have questions about what it means to think about journalism in small communities. It's something relatively new, I think, for Peru. We are still a step behind the evolution of journalism, maybe in other areas of the world.
I don't know that you're behind. Oftentimes I have Europeans come to visit me in New York and they say, oh, you're in America, you're ahead. And I say, no, we're just dying before you do. And you actually might have some more time if you're behind, as odd as that might sound. I'm not saying it's easy to serve a smaller community and in a smaller country, right? If I want to serve trans people in New York, then there are a lot of them. And I have a lot of scale in New York and a lot of scale in the United States. So I recognize that small has a different definition, but a community of a few thousand people can be enough to support some journalistic work. There's a company called Village Media in Canada that I wrote about a few weeks ago that serves towns of between 50,000 and 150,000 people. They primarily use advertising. They also get contributions, and they get revenue of more than $1 million in a lot of cases. They've made a model to work serving a medium-sized town or city, and they can do the journalism there with a staff of 4, 6, 8 people. So it's much smaller than the old newspaper used to be, but it still serves the town. And it still does it. Meanwhile, I also know blogs still that with 1 or 2 people that can serve a business community or a local community and get just enough money to pull by. It's hard, but it's possible.
There's a question from Adrian Waman, thanking you for your words. They make me feel I'm not insane. And he believes that listening to problems doesn't only belong to journalism. And he's quoting what was happening in Peru, that COVID has reflected or highlighted all the colonial society we live in, all the racial problems as well, a bit what was happening in America. In a way, should journalism be a reflection or a mirror of society?
Or an effort to fix society. You're quite right. I mean, we are also in essence dealing with our post-colonial history as well in a different way. And I think that it starts with, I want to be careful because often people say, give voice to the voiceless. There's no one who's voiceless. Everyone's always had a voice. The question is whether they were heard. And the internet is wonderful because it does enable everyone to speak. That includes people who haven't been heard. It includes hate mongers and fascists and racists. So the internet brings all these voices out at once, and we're not sure what to do with that yet. I just got into a argument on Twitter this morning with a professor who in essence was saying, get rid of Facebook. Well, no, because if you try to walk away from Facebook and Twitter, you walk away from these voices who were not heard. The problem with the internet, I think, is that so far it has been built primarily to speak, not to listen. I think that one thing you can do is find ways to find communities who have not been heard and listen to them and amplify their voices. Now, this goes back to that question of external journalism. You amplify their voices to the communities around, but you also serve their voices. You help them have stronger voices. You help inform their voices. You help inform what they want to say. You help inform their priorities and needs and best practices and solutions. So, pardon me, yes, I think that we're not going to fix this overnight. We're not the solution to it. We're part of the problem in media. We have been. So one thing we have to do is recognize what media have done wrong. Who have we left out? Who has not been at the table in a newsroom? We've tried for decades now to get more diversity in American newsrooms and failed. My school, I'm proud to say, is highly diverse, but we still have work to do there, much work to do there to understand that people like me haven't listened sufficiently. So I think that it's a great question. It's an important question. And I guess my advice would be to find the communities that haven't been heard and listen to them and then see what comes out of that. See what needs they have, see what they have to offer the larger community. I'm sure you'll be inspired from there.
We are already inspired. Elio Leturia asks, what do you think the future of ethnic media in the US is? For instance, the media in Spanish, which is obviously a community that's growing.
I'm delighted you asked that because we have at the Newmark School we have the nation's only master's degree in bilingual Spanish-English journalism, so please come. We also have a Center for Community Media. We used to call it community and ethnic media, but ethnic is not the word we use now, so we use community. We have an initiative in Spanish language media. I'll explain in a second. We just started a new one. We just hired the head of a new one for African-American media. And this is also aimed at the media that exists outside of our school to try to help them survive and help them in better businesses, both old media, old newspapers, and new media online. So the head of the program is named Graciela Moszkowski. She's a brilliant journalist from Argentina, has written some books, and she has a program in Spanish language media where, in fact, 2 days ago, we were supposed to have our annual Spanish language media summit in the US. We clearly did not. But she brings together all the leaders of Spanish language media in the US and media serving Latino media, communities rather. And they share best practices, they share problems, they share solutions. There's a vibrant model there. Now they're suffering in the business as well, but I think they have a very bright future because, again, big, old, white, male mass media has not served those communities. On the internet, they can be served by new outlets. And we've had one session with African-American media about how to cover the racial strife we have had in the US. And it's inspiring to see how they adapt journalism and do a good job. So I think there's a very bright future. It's a hard future because advertisers don't understand fully the value of this media. The communities they serve are often poorer and don't have the money for expensive subscriptions. Foundations do give some money to them, but then lose interest quickly, and that's a problem. But I think what we have to do is to create an entrepreneurial model for new publications, new online publications to serve various communities. And I think we can do that, and you can come to New York and do that with us.
Ramiro Escobar asks, do you think issues such as the environment and health will become more important in the world that will come after the pandemic? Can we expect more emphasis on these issues?
I hope so. I think so. I think that just as with health, We have not recognized the impact of racism on environmental issues. That after our hurricanes in the US, we found that it was poorer communities that bore the greatest impact. That was true in New Orleans. It was true in parts of New York and New Jersey, where I live. So I think that it is critically important, and I hope we're going to see more interest. I think the younger generation cares profoundly because it's your future, and I think that's going to force more coverage around environment.
A young student from our faculty, actually a student of mine, Graylene Arenas, asks, it has been said that a lot of journalists only show a part of the information and they are quite biased. What do you think about bias in journalism?
I think that we all are born and live and grow up with biases. And the important thing is to be transparent, is to be aware of them and to be transparent about them and to say that I have a different lived experience than you have. I don't think there's any possibility we will ever be objective or neutral. There isn't such a thing. And I think that was a false promise we made to the public that is coming back to bite us now, because there's an expectation that we're supposed to be neutral and the platforms are supposed to be neutral. Well, it doesn't exist. We're all human. We all have a bias and a perspective. The hard part is, how do we understand our own bias and how do we understand other people's biases in that context? Now, that's not to say that we just go off and start screaming what we want to scream. We are still journalists. We are bound to facts. We are bound to intellectual honesty. We're bound to telling uncomfortable truths and fairness and completeness. Those are all the ethics that separate us from people who merely have opinions. But within that, we still have perspectives, and we have to be aware of that. One of the hardest things happening in the United States right now is people thinking they're not racist because they have friends who are Black, or they don't do awful things. Well, no, we all live in a system that is racist. This is a lesson I have had to learn as I've grown. And so we've got to recognize what that bias is in ourselves, the implicit bias in what we do. That's a lot of what's happening with the police in America, is understanding that bias, recognizing it's there. To act as if we can get past it and not going to have it won't do us any good. Our job as journalists, I think, is to draw it out, understand it, explain it, give it back to people in a mirror.
Francesco Tucci asks, what do you think about mistakes that editors have made and maybe also journalists following new technologies without understanding the logic and missing the role of filtering real information versus fake news?
So then we get to the question of truth. And a lot of people are expecting Facebook to be the arbiter of truth. And I don't think that works, because we don't want one arbiter of truth. We don't want an official truth. An official truth is what comes from an authoritarian government. Truth is a choice you make when you judge the things that you hear, and you're given the critical faculties to judge well. So I think the truth is more of a process than a thing. And the editors tended to believe that they were the ones who set the public agenda. They knew what the truth was. They will lecture the public and tell them the truth. Our job really, I think, is to enable and empower the public to make better decisions on their own. Now, journalism alone can't do that. That comes primarily from education. But maybe we should see our role more often as educators to do that, and to think about how we judge our success or failure with how good the decisions people make are. Now, obviously, in the United States, we have failed miserably, and the test is Donald Trump. A third of this country listens to his lies, and they are lies, and wants to believe them. Well, that means that we didn't do a good job in this country of informing as many people as possible, and we have to recognize that failure.
Rolando Chumpitasi, a journalist, asks, I think we have always had the recipe in front of us, but we have not listened to it. Going back to community journalism is going back to the roots. It is to return to journalism hard and pure, or pure and hard. The one who interprets, analyzes, and goes against the current. Where is the solution?
I can't say it any better than you already have, Rolando. I think that's exactly right. It is going back to the return to journalism hard and pure. I love that. I think that if we get close to communities and recognize their needs, they will recognize the value we bring them. And it's like that case in Spaceship Media where people said, can you help us? That comes first from listening to those communities and building trust with them, which we probably didn't have. And then perhaps we can start to collaborate together. So I think it comes from listening to build trust, to give people the value they need. And then I hope that they'll see that we have something in common.
Adriana Mayor, another student, asks, what is the future of the United States? Will they have a continuity of Republican power, or will the Democrats lead again? Quite a political question.
I think we cannot take anything for granted. That's what happened the last time. That's how we got Donald Trump. And I think we have to work very hard to go past that. Part of the problem is back to this question of neutrality and objectivity. The New York Times thinks it's its job to be neutral, not to be part of the opposition. They say, well, if your opposition is fascism, then it is your job to be part of the opposition, New York Times. It is your job to be honest with the public and tell them when the president and the vice president lie. The president and the vice president just said that if we took fewer tests, we would have fewer cases of COVID. What incredible stupidity. But newspapers tend to treat that carefully. Well, the president says this. No, they're giving you propaganda. They're trying to lie to you. We have to figure out where our North Star is. So I take nothing for granted. I would hope that we could return to a Democrat in the White House and even in the Senate. But then the amount of work needed to draw back the damage done in the last 3 years will only get us back to the same country that gave us Donald Trump. So there is much, much work to do. And I just hope we don't lose more lives along the way, but I'm afraid we're going to.
Okay, the last question, última pregunta from Klaus Berkinsholt. Any thoughts on journalism and post-truth? Our last question, última pregunta.
I don't think we're post-truth. I don't think that most people don't want to believe in the truth. The aide to President Trump said that we have alternative facts. Unfortunately, that does seem to be the case. But another senator of the United States said you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. But people do believe that now. So I think that that is the danger. But I believe that in COVID, we're seeing that the majority of people do care about truth. They do care about facts. Their lives and their families' lives are depending upon this. And I think that's something for us to appeal to and work to. May I ask you a favor? These are such great questions. I feel so bad leaving now. Could you, I don't have the ability. I think you can copy all the questions. If you could send them all to me, I'll try to answer a few more and send them to you.
Yes, of course. We really thank you for your time. You've given us a North Star, no, un norte. So thank you very much on behalf of the journalist faculty here and of the students and our community. I don't know if it's going to say goodbye or not, but I think you really have given us a lot of hope and a lot of things to think about right now.
Well, no, I want to say thank you. And I want to say that it is the 296 people here who are my North Star and who give me hope because you care. So, gracias.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Les pido por favor que completen la encuesta que acabamos de publicar. Será muy importante para nosotros saber cuáles han sido sus sentimientos alrededor de todo lo que hemos escuchado. Y hemos puesto en el chat también la dirección donde pueden volver a ver esta entrevista. En verdad, creo que Jeff Jarvis nos ha dejado muchas ideas interesantes que pueden cambiar nuestro trabajo a futuro, tanto en la escuela como en el quehacer periodístico profesional. Así que pueden volverla a ver. Hay muchos datos interesantes. Les agradezco de todo corazón haber estado con nosotros. Espero que hayan disfrutado tanto como yo he disfrutado, y creo que todo el equipo de la carrera de Comunicación y Periodismo de la UPC también. Ha sido un gusto tenerlos con nosotros.